All right, it's noon now, so I'll get started with my introductions so we can jump right into the presentation. Welcome to the session Comparison of Rubbings Descriptions for Resource Discovery and Linkage. The session is being live streamed to the LD4 YouTube channel and recorded, and it will be saved on YouTube for future viewing. Be sure to check out the useful resources on this intro slide, including things like the Twitter hashtag, the link to join Slack, and the tech support channel. As this is a webinar, the best way to ask questions is to make use of the built-in Q&A function, and we'll make sure that Margaret and Lee see those questions. Now to introduce the session. Our speakers today are Lee Yang and Margaret E.I. Kipp. Lee Yang is a PhD candidate in the School of Information Studies, University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Her research interests are in knowledge organization, metadata, linked data, and knowledge discovery. Margaret Kipp is an associate professor in the School of Information Studies, University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Her research interests are in metadata, resource description, information organization, classification, information retrieval, social tagging, semantic web, and linked data. Today's presentation will focus on the Open Digital Rubbings collection and the study of metadata schemes and descriptions of rubbings in different institutions, cultures, and countries. Take it away, Lee and Margaret.
Okay, thank you for the introduction. Our talk is about a comparison of rubbings descriptions for resource discovery and linkage. Rubbings are a universal print technology which has been used for centuries to preserve and disseminate cultures and civilizations. It's been used in a number of countries, including China, Germany, Japan, the UK. In China, the evidence shows that the earliest rubbings can be dated to the Tang Dynasty, which was from 1600 AD to 907 AD. In the UK, brass monuments first appeared around the 13th century, and rubbings were introduced at a later time. Here you can see two examples of rubbings taken from stone or brass exemplars. All right, the original objects of rubbings can be all kinds of different things. We just have a list of examples here. Coins, bricks, roof tiles, ceramics, stelae, tombstones, pillars, cliffs, rocks, vessels, oracle bones, etc. Anything that could be chiseled or formed to hold text or images. And the study of rubbings is of high value for studying history and art because it demonstrates information about a culture. Cataloging of rubbings has existed for a long time, but of course rubbings predate cataloging by quite a bit. In China, cataloging of epigraphs and rubbings arose in the Northern Song Dynasty and was revived in the Qing Dynasty. We have two examples here of earliest known Chinese rubbings catalogs. The Ji Gu Lu, which was attributed to Ouyang Xiu around 1064 AD, and the Jin Shi Lu, which was attributed to Zhao Mingcheng and others around 1131 AD. And in the West, there were several catalogs of brasses that appeared in the 19th century, and these were some of the earliest ones. One was a manual of monumental brasses in 1861, and a series of monumental brasses from 1864. Rubbings were often cataloged along with objects in the past, so these catalogs just of rubbings were actually relatively rare. Okay. Here are some examples of some open digital rubbings collections, which are available on the web. This increases accessibility and preservation, and anybody can go and look at these rubbings. Digitization has been a mainstream practice in libraries and museums and archives for quite a while now. And the digitization of rubbings allows the rubbings to be more open to the public and provides a much wider reach for the collections of museums and archives and libraries. Right. So one of the things we discovered as we've been looking at rubbings is that, for example, each of the museums on the previous slide uses different structures and levels of detail to describe their rubbings collections, and they use different metadata schemas as well. So some examples that we found in our research so far, we won't claim this is 100% comprehensive, but this is quite a few schemas already. You have MODS, the Metadata Object Description Scheme from the Library of Congress, which was especially designed for library applications, but of course it is a fairly universal method of describing anything, as long as you're not looking for really object-specific categories. And MODS has been used by the Fine Arts Library at Harvard Yenching Library of Harvard University to describe rubbings. You have the CDWA, categories for the description of works of art, which of course was specifically designed to describe works of art. There are also two rubbing-specific metadata schemas that we found, both for Chinese rubbings. The Chinese Cultural Relics Protection Industry Standard, which is a specific metadata schema for cataloging rubbings, and a rubbings collection schema from the Institute of History and Philology of the Academia Sinica in Taiwan. Additionally, there are a number of homegrown metadata schemas for describing rubbings. The British Museum has one, the Spurlock Museum of World Cultures, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Right. So in this study, we present an overview and a comparative analysis of these metadata schemes of different rubbings collections. So the purpose of the comparison is to just increase the awareness of the various rubbing schemas that are being used, and to sort of enhance an understanding of the influence of different cultural backgrounds on the description of rubbings. And this also affects, is also affected, of course, by the rubbings being from different cultures initially, not just the culture of the people describing the rubbings. And it's to enrich the existing comparative research of rubbings, contribute to a common rule to describe rubbings resources in linked data, and identify the important factors for rubbings data modeling. So we designed a comparative guide, you can see that in table 1, to examine structural, functional, and cultural features of the metadata schemas. So what we were interested in was some method of comparing what are very different metadata schemas, which can't be directly compared without some kind of framework. So under structure, we have a couple of categories that probably require just a tiny bit more explanation. The number of same modules and the number of similar modules. So in the case of same modules, we're looking at modules that have the same upper level categories with the same subfields. And we're not taking into account differences caused by translation between different languages. As long as it means the same thing, we're listing it as the same. We also adopted a 6-category typology of metadata, which is from based on the Getty and the NISO typologies, which are very commonly used in metadata. And these are the standard administrative metadata, descriptive, preservation metadata, technical, structural, and use metadata. Finally, in a previous study, we adopted a 4-level model, which we called the relationship model of Chinese rubbings, in which we identified rubbings relationships from existing rubbings records. And we use this to assist us in our comparison of these metadata schemas. So our 4-level model starts with the work. And in this case, the work is the rubbing. We also include a level for the original object from which the rubbing was rubbed. And then we have different versions of the rubbings, of course. That's the benefit of having the work upper level category to collect everything together. And then, of course, there are the digitized rubbings, which are themselves a wholly new phenomenon as well. I mean, the original point of rubbings was to disseminate on paper what couldn't easily be disseminated by moving the stelae around, for example. So although we designed this based on the Chinese rubbing specifically. This model is actually fairly general and fits well with the brass rubbings and would fit well with other rubbings as well. Right, so we used the 7 schemes that we mentioned before to do our comparison. So as part of the comparison, we started out by using our structural analysis and looking at levels. So as you can see from the table, the Chinese, the CDWA mods and the Sinica scheme have the most number of upper level categories, with the Met scheme being a bit of an outlier with only one upper level category. The majority of these schemas are quite hierarchical, allowing you to provide quite a complex description of the rubbing. And the number of fields actually varies significantly. Anybody who's worked with CDWA before will be familiar with the fact that the CDWA is a very complex schema, which includes a lot of potential fields, which you can choose from to describe an art object. Other schemas are less complex, but provide, I guess, less ability to describe specific details. So in table 3, we've looked at the statistics for the metadata types of the schemes using the 6 metadata types from the NISO and Getty standard description. And most of the schemes don't actually cover all of the types of metadata, and the ones they do cover, they cover somewhat unevenly. This makes sense because in any description of an object, you're going to be covering different facets just because objects are different. So administrative and descriptive metadata were the most common items being described, which also makes sense, of course. In a museum, your goal is to describe the item as well as possible and to provide some administrative information such as provenance and things like that. Preservation is also an important aspect of dealing with any work of art or any object which is older and requires specific preservation information. So as you can see, the majority of the schemes do provide preservation information about the rubbings. All right, and in table 4, we have some statistics corresponding to our relationship model, looking at the works, objects, rubbings, and digitized rubbings. In this case, actually, the majority of the schemes did provide metadata fields that belong to each of our 4 levels. Mods didn't provide anything specific for digitized rubbings. And the Spurlock Museum scheme didn't have the overarching concept of works or objects. But otherwise, this is fairly comprehensive. Lee.
Yeah, thank you, Margaret. I'll take it over. Besides the general comparisons, we did several specific comparisons in depth. The first one is the comparison between the Chinese standard and the Sinica scheme. Since both schemes were designed for describing Chinese rubbings, they meet the description of the special features of the rubbings. For example, the 2 schemes both describe authentication of the objects, calligraphy features, creators with different roles, different titles of a rubbing, marks on a rubbing, including colophons and seals, etc. The 2 schemes have 6 similar modules, which are title, type, condition, copyright, exhibition, and version, and they have one same module, that is technique. The main differences exist in reference, marks, title, and transcription. The 2 schemes have distinct numbers of subfields of these top categories. Generally, the Sinica scheme is more structured and detailed than the Chinese standard. Both schemes overfit brass robins, which do not have the spatial features as the Chinese robins have. Next slide, please. Thank you. We did a comparison within the museum schemes, including the Met scheme, the Spurlock Museum, the Spurlock scheme, the British Museum scheme, and the CDWA. These schemes were not designed for robins specifically, with the emphasis on the commonality of the museum collections. They are adequate for registering robins with some information loss. The Spurlock scheme and the CDWA have two similar modules. The module describing physical features and the module describing exhibition information. The Spurlock scheme only describes the robins level and the digitized robins level without disclosing subject origins and the stories behind robins, which might be essential to understand the robins and their values. The Met scheme has only two fields describing works and objects, plus the robins levels and the digitized robins level. Compared to the compactness of the Met and the Spurlock schemes, the British Museum scheme and CDWA are comprehensive in terms of the numbers of fields and the coverage of levels. They are more granular and pay more attention to describing the objects and the works embodied in the objects. Next slide, please. We also did a comparison between MODS and CDWA, the representatives of library schemes and museum schemes. CDWA covers all four levels of the relationship model, while MODS doesn't describe the digitized robins level. It is interesting to see that though the total number of fields of MODS is less than 1/3 of CDWA, it has more than twice the fields as CDWA to describe subject information. The majority of fields of CDWA, around 77% of the total, fall into the robins level category. As to the typology, MODS only covers administrative and descriptive metadata, where descriptive metadata accounts for 90% of the total fields. CDWA includes administrative, descriptive, preservation, structural, and use metadata. MODS does not describe information like the exhibition history, examination condition history, orientation, factor, conservation history, etc. that are described in CDWA. All the schemes, we also examine the common features of all the schemes. All the schemes have common fields of title, creator, identifier, measurement, technique, material, location, language, and subject, though they may use different terms. All the schemes have fields to link external resources. The fields are related works, link resources, related items, and reference to link artifacts, artworks, bibliographic material, etc. Table 5 shows the fields and the types of external resources the schemes can link. The Met scheme and MODS support linking to any types of resources. The linking fields of Met scheme fit better in the linked data context. We're also examining the culture-specific fields. The Chinese standard and the Seneca scheme have culturally specific fields to describe the features of Chinese robins. For example, in Chinese standard, the title field is subdivided into 8 subcategories, including first title, head title, reverse side title, etc. These titles support the cataloging of special features of Chinese stela. Authenticity is a special features of Chinese robins, since the Chinese robins may be robbed from a record, not the original object. The inscription marks field in Chinese standard and modules of colophons and seals in Seneca scheme can record special marks on Chinese robins, which the brass robins normally don't have. Both schemes can describe serial robbings information, which is seldom seen in brass robbings. In Seneca scheme, the modules describing the objects of Han Dynasty stone relief, bronzeware, Buddhist stone statues, and oracle bones are special for certain types of objects. It also has Chinese date and Western date fields to record different formats of date, since most Chinese robbings adopted the regnal years, not the Gregorian calendar. Next, thank you. To examine the 7 schemes practically, we used a Chinese robbing titled The Preface of the Sutra of the Supreme Sacrosanct Dharani from the Buddhist Summit inscribed in the Langzhong Tower, and a brass robbing called Zhang Jie and his wife as the 2 cases. The Chinese robbing case describes information covering the works level, the objects level, and the robbings level. The brass robbing case describes mainly the works and the objects levels. We have several findings. First, context information is important to disclose comprehensive information and understand the values of robbings. It can reflect various information of that time, such as history, culture, art, and architecture. It also enables more links between resources. CDWA has a context module to cover historical, cultural event, architectural context, archaeological context, and historical location context. But other schemes only have general fields to accommodate the context information, such as note, description, research remarks, but they are not structured. Next. The brass robbing case shows detailed information about the figures and their relationships, their apparel and accessories, and their surroundings. Unlike the text inscriptions, which can be cataloged into specific and structuralized modules, in most schemes, the information of icons and decorations is described through non-structured fields. A structuralized module to describe image inscriptions would make the information more discoverable. The brass robbing case describes the relationships of the figures related to the brass. British Museum scheme, MODS, and CDWA can describe person-to-person relationships, but Chinese standard and Seneca scheme underfit brass robbings in describing person-to-person relationships. All the schemes cover more than 2 levels of the relationship model, and the 5 schemes cover all 4 levels of the model. But some schemes do not differentiate the object level and the robbings level in certain fields, like technique, material, date, etc. This does not affect cataloging the brass robbing case much, since the case focuses on describing the information at the works level and the objects level. However, it does not fit the Chinese robbing case, which stresses both the object and the robbings. If the metadata fields are not stratified by the relationship model levels, it might cause misunderstanding. For example, the measurements, the creating dates, and the material of the objects and the robbing might be different. It comes to the end summary. We did a qualitative comparative study of 7 metadata schemes used for describing robbing resources. They have common fields to describe the same or similar features, though usually they adopted different terms. They have different complexity and granularities, thus leading to various degrees of detail and different coverages. Each scheme has its emphasis and focus and serves its main purpose. When using different schemes to describe different types of robbings, information loss or overfit of the schemes might happen. Our study has implications for linked data scheme development. The first, information stored in a general node field is harder to translate to linked data format. Second, identification of relationships from existing data relies on existing cataloging standards or research to expand existing standards. The reference, here's the reference. Next, that's the end. Thank you.
Thank you both so much for that wonderful presentation. I'm not seeing any questions in the Q&A yet. People feel free to drop questions in there. You can put them in the chat as well if you'd like. One question I had for you that came up was, do you think all these different standards are necessary because of the differences in language and culture? Or when you were comparing them, did you feel like some of them maybe could have been consolidated?
Because the 7 schemes, they stress different fields, you know, from the 55 fields to the 398. I believe each institution, they want to stress on a certain field of this. So we can't see that the more the better, but we just say if it just serves as your purpose, and then it works. But for in the linked data context, I think they might be more or less improved to fit for the linked data.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you.
Sure.
I have another kind of non-metadata related question. How do these rubbings get preserved for so long? Like, how is a rubbing from like the 13th century preserved until today? I'm just honestly just curious about that.
The case we found are actually the Chinese rubbing case we found is in a research paper, and the other one is in a book.
Okay, so it's like not the, is it not the actual item? It's like a
no.
Okay, gotcha.
The actual item items are very precious. So
okay,
yeah. So the digitized rubbings, the collections are very important for us to share the rubbings all over the world.
Well, I'm not seeing any more questions coming through. I do want to thank you both for really interesting. Oh, we got one. Okay, there we go. So from Zoe Waldron, did you find that museums frequently use homegrown metadata schemas?
Yes, absolutely. Actually, we found more collections, digital collections, and we found they all use different ones. But some of them might be modified or adjusted from others. I think from more comprehensive schemes. Yeah.
All right, well, I think we can wrap things up a little bit early. Thank you all for that. Please feel free to continue to interact with the presenters on Slack or via Twitter, or whichever ways are best to contact you all.